So what are we doing? I mean, are we just selling slave labor? Hello, Christians, you want to get out of the trafficking business, but that's literally what you're doing now. Thanks for coming back to see us at Religious Rejects. Today, we're going to talk about immigration. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready, and I'm just so angry this morning, so I'm just saying, like, I'm ramped up already this morning.
She's ready.
I'm ready.
Look out.
So
we are now 1 year into an administration that has been using our own people to rid our nation of people they deem illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been hard to watch.
Mm-hmm.
It's been, for me, myself, scary, knowing that there doesn't seem to be a lot of preparation on the part of the administration and the agents out there. So it seems as though they are just willy-nilly pulling people over and then asking questions later. And as someone who is married to a Guatemalan man and has Guatemalan part Guatemalan babies, that's really scary for me of what could happen if my daughter somebody decides to just pull her around and start asking her questions.
Mm-hmm.
Or for my husband to just, be pulled over because he looks like somebody that may need papers or is illegal. So for me, this has been really hard in that sense and frustrating.
It's been a really difficult year, and it's only gotten worse recently. We are recording this episode early in February, but these things have not stopped since this administration came into being last year at the beginning of 2025. And we have just seen ICE in Minneapolis, and they're now moving into other cities. They're claiming to take some 700 agents out of Minneapolis and are going to reassign them other places. That still means that there's 2,300 ICE agents in Minneapolis, still in the Minneapolis area right now, the Twin Cities area. So it's a huge show of force. There's all kinds of civil liberties that have been violated and all of these things. And so what we're going to focus on today is looking at what does the Bible, quote unquote, say about immigration, about borders. The Pope came out with a statement at the end of 2025, in November 2025, about immigration in the United States. The U.S. Council of Bishops in the Catholic Church, they came out with a statement before that was even stronger than what the Pope had said. And what we're going to be looking at and referring to is that, as well as Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House, first of all, being asked about the Pope's feelings and statement about immigration in the United States, making a statement at a press conference, and then following up with a longer statement on X, formerly known as Twitter.
And the reason I think we feel we want to cross into this line is because Mike Johnson is very much using religion as the reason for this immigration stance that this administration has. And listen, that's our field, baby. Now you're in our backyard. So we get to reject, if we feel like it, some of these religious ideas that Mike Johnson and others hold. Along with, we're going to stand right there with the Pope and say, yeah, no, we reject your idea of what this is.
So this is a little different format than usual because we are rejecting right off the bat a lot of the rhetoric that is coming from the evangelical far right conservative side of things. So we're just coming out at the beginning and saying we reject these things. We're
Yeah.
not going to make you wait until the end of the
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah, nope.
Mike Johnson says at the end of his statement that he put on X, he said, despite the unfounded claims of the left, supporting a strong national border is a very Christian thing to do. The Bible tells us so. Well, we hope by now that anytime you see something that says the Bible says this, the Bible tells us that, the Bible definitively says this, that, or the other, we hope that it makes you very suspect of anything that somebody says that is based on that. Because, as we've pointed out, the Bible is a really complex document. There's so many things going on in it, and there's so much that is misunderstood in the Bible, taken out of context, and all that kind of stuff. So we are going to get into all of these things and more. So first off, we wanted to share a little bit about who we are. So my ancestors, I'm the descendant of part of the Scandinavian waves of immigration into the United States in the 1800s, the late 1800s. So my dad's side of the family is Norwegian, back 4 generations. My mom's side is Swedish and Danish. And my grandmother, my mom's mom, actually immigrated from Denmark when she was 3 years old. So that is the closest I am to a immigration story. But most of them are like 4 to 5 generations back.
Right.
And my ancestors settled in Minnesota and North Dakota on the recently cleared land. And I've been learning a lot about what happened with the Sioux and everything that went on to make the land available to these European immigrants that were coming for a better future, to create a new life for themselves. I mean, some were looking for religious freedom. I mean, there's all kinds of things, but a lot of it was economic, I suspect. So that's my background, is that my ancestors basically moved into the areas of Minnesota and North Dakota that had been violently cleared by the American government of the indigenous people from their land. So that is part of my story.
Mine is very similar. My mother's side is all Finnish. Her mother was Finnish. Her father was Finnish. They also came over in the late 1800s. They just went to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So I am a descendant of Upers, which I'm very proud of. And my father's side is a little bit different. His father was German, and their family came over similar at the same time. I don't have as much records, but they came over probably in the late 1800s and ended up in Detroit. My grandmother's side, however, was Scottish, and they came over by way of Canada. So I don't think that counts as an immigrant if, like, my great-grandmother was Canadian and came down. It's weird.
No, Canadians are considered immigrants.
I know. Well, I know, but it's just one of those things. It's like, Canada doesn't come up on the DNA. Scottish does, because that's where they came from. And it was like they kind of had a little bit of a dip and then came down. So Scottish, Finnish, and German.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right.
Fun. And everybody met in Detroit.
The melting pot of the United States.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah. So the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops came out with a statement on November 12th, 2025. And one of the things they said was, we are disturbed when we see among our people a climate of fear and anxiety around questions of profiling and immigration enforcement. We are saddened by the state of contemporary debate and the vilification of immigrants. We are concerned about the conditions in detention centers and the lack of access to pastoral care.
Oh.
We lament that some immigrants in the United States have arbitrarily lost their legal status. We oppose the indiscriminate mass deportation of people, and they prayed for an end to dehumanizing rhetoric and violence, whether directed at immigrants or at law enforcement. The U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops came out with this statement on November 12th, and then the Pope was later asked about that about a few days later. So he said these things on November 18th.
Okay.
He said, when people are living good lives, and many of them in the United States for 10, 15, 20 years, to treat them in a way that is extremely disrespectful, to say the least, is not acceptable. And he approved of what the bishops had said and written in their statement. And he said the pastoral message is a very important statement. And I would invite especially all Catholics, but people of goodwill, to listen carefully to what they said. We have to look for ways of treating people humanely, treating people with the dignity that they have. No one has said that the United States should have open borders, said the Pope. I think every country has a right to determine who and how and when people enter. If people are in the United States illegally, there are ways to treat that. There are courts. There is a system of justice, but the system has a lot of problems that should be addressed. The other thing that the Pope referenced is Matthew 25:35, when he was talking about the concern about immigration and what's happening in the United States. He said, Jesus says very clearly, at the end of the world, we're going to be asked, how did you receive the foreigner? For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. That's Matthew 25:35. And that's what the Pope is directly referencing. So these are the statements that were made in November by Catholics, the Catholic Conference of Bishops and the Pope. And then last week, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, was asked his reaction to what the Pope had said. This is from an article in the Religion News Service that I found. Mike Johnson is a Southern Baptist, and he spent years working for the conservative Christian legal group Alliance Defending Freedom. And what he said last week in the press conference, he said he acknowledged the Bible calls on believers to, quote, welcome the sojourner, but he insisted the command is an admonition to individuals, not to the civil authorities. And he argued that Romans 13 describes civil authorities as agents of wrath to bring punishment upon the wrongdoer, and that, quote, assimilation, end quote, of immigrants is, quote, expected and anticipated, end quote. He said, quote, sovereign borders are biblical and right, and they're just. It's not because we hate the people on the outside, it's because we love the people on the inside. End quote. And so he also says that he's happy to have this lengthy debate with anybody anytime they want to. So I do love that William Barber, who has been active in debates. He's been very active for many years now in the public sphere, and he has challenged Mike Johnson to a debate. So
fantastic.
we'll see if he actually takes Barber up on that. That was on a podcast last week, Complexified. So then what we did is we looked at Johnson's the full statement that he then sent out on X.
Yes.
It's interesting because there are places that I actually agree with some of the things that he says. One of the things he says is context is critical.
Oh.
I agree with that 100%. And I agree with that 100%. And I think he's taking a lot of things out of context.
Yes.
In his statement. Can we say, I just want to say right off the bat, how odd it is that the Speaker of the House, which is a civil office in our government, is citing the Bible as theological defense of borders and border patrol and border security.
Yes.
And that is the main reason he is doing what he is doing, which I just want to say once again, what a strange place we are in
Yes.
25 and 26, that this is what our country has come to.
Yes.
That the Speaker of the House is using biblical justifications to
determine policy.
And to defend cruel and inhumane, and I would argue illegal,
Yes.
treatment of immigrants, refugees, and undocumented people. So he says, it is, of course, a central premise of Judeo-Christian teaching that strangers should be treated with kindness and hospitality. I agree with that.
Yes.
We are each called to love God first and to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Yes.
I agree with that as well.
We do not reject that.
We can agree on that.
Yes.
What he says next, however, is interesting, because what he says is that the greatest commandment was never directed to the government, but to individual believers. And this is what he says in his statement. This is a direct quote. The Bible teaches, again, let's just
Yes.
always say, what does the Bible teach? It's never that easy. He says the Bible teaches that God ordained and created 4 distinct spheres of authority. 1, the individual, 2, the family, 3, the church, and 4, civil government. And each of these spheres is given different responsibilities. And so his argument here is that an individual is accountable for his or her own behavior. The family is commanded to bring up children in the training and instruction of the Lord and to provide for their relatives. These are things. And then the church is commanded to make disciples and equip people for the work of ministry. And civil government, this is where we start having issues. I'm not going to agree with all the stuff that he just said, but the civil government is established to faithfully uphold and enforce the law so that order can be maintained in this fallen world, crime can be kept at bay, and people can live peacefully. And he's referring to Romans 13 and 1 Timothy there. So Romans 13, let's get into this part of it, right? Because this is, first of all, what Johnson is saying here is that the civil government has a theological responsibility before God.
Interesting.
Which is not how our country was founded.
No, it absolutely wasn't. And in fact, didn't they break a whole lot of laws in order to become this great country? Aren't we celebrating the 250th anniversary of these traitors who turned their back against our government, which was at the time King George?
Yeah.
You know, and didn't they do it hostilely? They took up arms. They threw tea into the Boston Harbor. That was so great, by the way. You know, all of these protests, you know, that they did in order to say, what you're doing is not okay. And we want something better.
Yeah.
That is how this country was founded. So then to have that argument then turned around by these same people that seem to value, in theory, or at least they claim to love the founding fathers, what they did, the Constitution, all of that stuff, but then to have them say to us, well, your protests should be more peaceful. Your whatever should be this. And if you don't like it, you really should just obey the laws because these are the laws. We also know some of these things are not lawful. The ICE agents are just pulling people out of cars. We were told, or at least the majority of people that voted for this administration understood that the immigration process would be taking out illegal people that had also broken the law. That was what we were told. And so far, I cannot figure out how a 5-year-old boy in Minnesota has broken the law and why that's the case. And the majority of the people we're finding are people that are trying very hard to do things the right way. It's just that we have a horrible immigration system. Really, if we want to talk about fixing immigration, let's just start with how to do it in the system. It takes years. It takes red tape. It takes so many things. And so you have these ICE agents walking to the courts, or the courthouses in Minnesota, arresting people who are actually doing exactly what their government told them to do.
Yes.
Be here 4 o'clock Friday. Let's talk about how we can get you to be a citizen. They do that, they're arrested. So for me, sorry, Mike Johnson, that's just bullshit.
Yeah.
And on top of that, they're also just, a lot of these people have the visas. They're okay to be here. But then we find too, even those that maybe are illegally here, why are they just sitting in a detainment center? What's happening? These detainment centers are horrific. They're not hospitable, so we're not being hospitable to the foreigners. There's nothing nice about them, from what I understand.
People aren't getting medical care.
Yes.
The food is terrible. People talk about how cold they are, and there's not enough blankets and all this stuff.
Yes.
There's not school for kids.
Right.
And then some of the people are getting sent from here into other countries, other third-party countries, not even the country they came from, but third-party countries. Those countries are being paid to keep people in prisons there, which are even more horrific than the detention centers here.
So what are we doing? I mean, are we just selling slave labor? I mean, hello, Christians. You want to get out of the trafficking business, but that's literally what you're doing now, is just trafficking immigrants to one country or another.
And paying that country
and
money
paying them.
to
I know.
detain them. Yeah.
Immigration is not something that's frowned upon in Scripture. In fact, it's welcome. We're to welcome the sojourner and love our neighbor as ourselves. But what's also important in the Bible is that assimilation is expected and anticipated and proper. You want to do this? Romans 13 says that the civil authorities are God's agents of wrath to bring punishment upon the wrongdoer. And it says if you do right, you have no fear of the civil authorities, but those civil authorities are necessary. It's a calling. It's a calling to maintain order in society, and we have not had that.
So what Mike Johnson is referencing here is the first couple verses of Romans chapter 13. And this is from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment.
Mm-hmm.
For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's agent for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the agent of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things Mike Johnson put in his statement is that context is critical.
Yes.
Let's look at the context of the book of Romans.
Okay.
Paul is imprisoned in a Roman prison.
Mm-hmm.
They probably are reading his written documents.
Yeah, probably.
That is what governing authorities do.
Yes.
They invade your privacy.
Yes.
which is what's happening right now all over the place, right?
Yes.
Do you think that Paul is going to sit in prison
Mm-hmm.
and be critical of the Roman Empire that has him in prison?
Mm-hmm.
He's going to say, yes, obey the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
He's going to say that.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense, except if you look at the context of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And why was he imprisoned? Because he's teaching about Jesus, and that was threatening to the Roman Empire.
Yes. So he broke a law, to be clear. So according to Mike Johnson, then Paul got what he deserved
Mm-hmm.
because he broke a law. That's why he's in jail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the whole logic of this way of thinking, this whole logic doesn't hold up because Paul is captive
Yes.
and he's not going to be critical of the Roman Empire. Everything that we know is that Paul was executed by the Roman Empire, and Romans was written during his imprisonment.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was already, his life was already threatened.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to look at the context, if we're going to do as what Mike Johnson says,
Mm-hmm.
context is critical,
Mm-hmm.
we have to read this passage from Paul with some suspicion.
Yes.
He is not a free person to be able to speak freely.
Right. Especially about the Romans.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Mm.
And there's some biblical scholars who wonder if this was even added later because it is so out of character
Yes.
with all of the other authentic Pauline writings.
Okay.
And so some people, now this is not a majority opinion, but there are scholars who wonder, was this something that was added later? We've talked about how as those earliest Christians got further away from, they were a radically egalitarian group of people. Slavery, if you're Christians, if you're a group of Christians together, there should be no slavery amongst Christians.
Right.
Male and female, there's no distinction between male or female. There's no distinction between Jew or Gentile. There's no distinction between slave or free. These are things Paul wrote in the letter to the Galatians.
Support independent conversations like this at patreon.com/religiousrejects.
Another thing that Mike Johnson talks about in his statement from Acts, quote, America has always been a haven for people legitimately seeking asylum from danger in their home country, but we must insist they pursue a course of legal immigration and not simply ignore our laws.
Right.
So this is a common argument about this, is that people need to do this in a legal way.
Right. Which we just talked about how is a very lengthy process, and a lot of these people that are being rounded up are doing exactly that. So again, he's saying all these things that, people feel like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. But he's ignoring the reality that most of these people are doing it the right way. And it really more comes down to they just really are using this as an excuse to get rid of people
Who are not white American,
Yes.
white-skinned people. Let's
Right.
name it.
Yeah.
We had an earlier episode talking about white Christian nationalism, and we have to call out
Yes.
the racism inherent in a lot of this, because that is part of what they're starting to do. Is the Supreme Court came out with a statement, and people, the ICE interpreted that, DHS interpreted it, that they can now racially profile people.
Yes, they can.
Which I can
Yes.
understand why you're more concerned about
Right.
your family, your husband and your kids who are not white.
Exactly.
So let's talk for a minute about legal immigration in the United States,
Okay.
because I wanted to really see more about this. So I looked up, what are the options for immigrating to the United States? So I got this from the Department of State's website on February 8th, 2026. So who knows what could be the case when somebody else looks at it. But there's a difference between immigrants and refugees.
Right.
Refugees are a legal category that was established after World War II and the horror of what happened in the Holocaust and how the Nazis did all these things. And so the international community came up with a way of determining, who are the people that need protection in terrible times. And so they came up with this term called a refugee. So it is from 1951, which I did not know. I didn't know it was that recent, but that's when refugees were defined. And there is now a United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. So refugees are officially classified as such by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. The Geneva Convention is the main international instrument of refugee law. So the same thing that talks about international human rights and definitions of genocide, things like that, that is from the Geneva Convention. They did a 1967 refinement of that because the original Geneva Convention protocol about refugee law was primarily focused on European refugees, and in 1967 they expanded it to address the issue of displacement of people from around the world and not just European displacement. One of the things that I learned is that the United States resettlement program of refugees is the largest in the world. However, in 2024, only 105,000 refugees were resettled in the United States.
Okay.
105,000. That's not that many.
No.
And they go through a whole screening process. First of all, there's the whole process of being designated a refugee from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. And then the United Nations High Commission on Refugees determines, kind of sorts through, okay, where can a refugee go? And then there's certain reasons why they decide to send refugees to the United States. So currently there are 42.5 million refugees in the world, and the United States resettled 105,000 in 2024. They have to go through interviews with 8 federal agencies, including the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI. There are 6 security database checks and biometric security checks screened against federal databases. There's medical screening, and there are 3 in-person interviews with Department of Homeland Security officers. People who are refugees have to go through so much screening in order to come to this country. I used to work with an agency in Austin, Texas that resettled refugees, and so I learned a lot about this. And it's so interesting because people, first of all, the whole refugee designation, if someone is a refugee, that is a legal term. That is a legal way to come to the United States. The other thing that I found shocking, these are people who have survived war, persecution. They've left everything. They've lost everything. They often had to leave their homelands with just the clothes on their back, They have to take out a loan from the United States government to pay for their airline tickets to come to the United States. And then they have to pay that back to the United States government. So, for example, here in Colorado Springs, there's an Afghan family. They had 11 kids, and then there's 2 parents. So there's 13 airline tickets that this family has to repay to the United States government. I really want to know, how are they getting free things from the United States government? Like, that is not free. They're paying it back. They do get food stamps. They get food assistance, TANF, temporary assistance for needy families for 3 months. That's it. They're expected to find work and to be able, and not many people who are refugees want to. Now, I will also say, people who are traumatized from living through war and persecution are not always capable of working either. So, you know,
fair.
I mean, that's also a thing. And so we have to determine, you know, like, how fair is that to expect people to be able to do that? However, refugees are probably screened more than any other immigrant to this country. So you've got refugees. That is one category. Then you have immigrants. So currently, right now, there are these kinds of visas that are available to someone wanting to immigrate to the United States. So there's immediate, relative, and family sponsored. So you have to either be a spouse of a U.S. citizen, a fiancé who wants to marry a U.S. citizen and wants to live in the United States, or a unmarried child of a U.S. citizen.
Okay.
So that's one thing. Then there's, if you're adopting a child, that's another visa. Then there's employer sponsored. There are 140,000 employment visas each year in the United States. 140,000. That's it. And that's for priority workers. Those are persons of exceptional ability, professionals holding advanced degrees, professionals and other workers. There's employment creation investors and certain special immigrants. 140,000 employment visas. That's ridiculous. That's so few. And then there's a special part of that employment is Afghans and Iraqis who worked on behalf of the U.S. government during the Iraqi and Afghanistan wars.
And yet some of those people are now being rounded up.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then the last kind is what's called a diversity immigrant visa. And this is for 55,000 immigrants can enter the U.S. each year from countries with low rates of immigration to the United States. So all told, there are 195,000 immigration visas available to people who want to immigrate to the United States. 195,000. That's it.
Right.
That's not that many.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to come and work here,
Right.
it's very difficult to do.
Right.
So when people talk about following the legal process, there is hardly a legal process to follow.
Right. And I think, unfortunately, that's what it's either by design.
Yes.
Or that's the whole point that the Republicans are trying to make. Listen, we're helping, but this is the amount of help that we're willing to give. And if somebody tries to skirt that and get here and cut the line, we're not going to let them do it. So
there's one last category, and those are asylum seekers.
Okay.
Now, this is also an international law designation. And this is another thing that has been, people say that the people who are seeking asylum are here illegally, and that is not true.
right.
What happens is a person comes to a border crossing and says, I am claiming asylum because I was being persecuted under there are particular categories they have to prove
Right.
that you were being persecuted under. And then that person has to go through a legal process. The thing is that the asylum seeking process is a legal process, but they are released into the country while their case works through the legal process. And these are the people that have been arrested at the courthouses, are the
Yes.
people seeking asylum. They have to go through a whole process to prove their asylum case.
Right.
And a judge determines if they are legally going to become an American citizen based on the international law statutes.
And I like that you keep saying international law, because if we want to point Mike Johnson back to Romans 13, where's the line then for us? I mean, is he just saying we can do whatever we want, or are we as a country as well underneath the laws of the United Nations and those collective groups that we are a part of as a way to keep the law and to not allow certain things to happen again, like what happened in Germany? Like there's reasons that the United Nations, the League of Nations was developed, and then that was to have a peacekeeping organization to keep everybody, and therefore there are laws.
And the United States is a signer of the Geneva Convention.
Yes.
So that means that we have agreed to be held accountable to these laws.
Yes.
And that is another question I have with some of the things that has happened, like Venezuela, these attacks on boats in the Caribbean and just killing people indiscriminately. I mean, there's so many questions, like, so if we're going to talk about, obeying civil authorities, then it seems that the U.S. government is not living up to their signature to the Geneva Convention.
Right. And I think this administration would say, well, to quote, Pirates of the Caribbean, it's more like guidelines.
The other thing I want to highlight about asylum seekers is that, and refugees, is that, like, for example, Haitians were considered asylum seekers, and they were allowed to come. There was a whole wave of them that came after the 2010 earthquake that devastated their country. They came here legally because they were designated asylum seekers.
Yes.
Cubans came here legally because they were designated, actually, which is a strange thing. They were considered parolees. So there's all this weird legal language that comes up with these different groups. But they have been designated, they're able to come under these particular laws and these particular categories. And so they're here legally. And what's happening right now is the administration is arbitrarily saying that they're removing that legal status. So Haitians are being deported because that legal status has now been removed. That sort of proves the lie of what Mike Johnson is saying here, is that people need to come here legally. And
Right.
Haitians, Cubans, the Somalis, they are also, many of them are refugees. Some of them are here under particular asylum laws and designations from the United States government. And so even refugees, so some of the resettlement agencies in Minneapolis, I saw a news report that refugees to this country have been arrested and are being detained, even though they are here legally as a refugee. Right. So when Johnson is saying that people need to follow the law, I would argue that ICE is not following the law. And the Trump administration is changing the laws and not giving people an opportunity to respond in, with any time or legal recourse.
Right. I think the administration has done, a great job, unfortunately, of equating anyone here illegally as a criminal. you know?
Well,
And
an
it's like-
immigration law is a civil thing. It is not
Yeah.
a criminal.
right, yeah.
There's the criminal legal code, and then there's the civil legal code. And immigration law is in the civil legal code, not the criminal legal code.
Another reason that it's like, these are criminals, and it's like, no. But then now, like, if an undocumented immigrant does something illegal, they use that to portray it as the whole. But let's keep going on
Yes.
Mike Johnson, because he said some other things. He talked about assimilation.
Yes.
He very much believes that anybody that comes to this country should then assimilate
Yes.
to our values, our language, all of these things. Hence the reason the Bad Bunny halftime show was so offensive is because Bad Bunny would most likely do it in Spanish. Even though he is an American citizen, he can do whatever he wants, but that's not okay. I would also like to point out and refer Mike Johnson to the fact that we were not held to that standard, we being the founding fathers and the pilgrims and the Puritans that all came over. Nobody assimilated when they came, Otherwise, we wouldn't have reduced and taken all the land of the Native Americans. We wouldn't be speaking English. We would be speaking other languages.
we certainly did not.
We did not assimilate. To me, it blows me away. Like, don't break the law. We broke the law. Well, then you have to assimilate. We didn't assimilate, And so, but now you're going to ask all these other people to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it blows my mind, the hypocrisy of it all.
What I've heard some people talk about is, you get to a lifeboat and you pull up the ladder. And so there's a lot of people who came to this country previously who were able to make a new life for themselves, to have the freedoms that we claim to offer in this country, which have, let's be honest about that as well, has not always been fairly distributed.
Agreed.
With people of color,
Right.
People of Chinese descent, African Americans, Mexican Americans coming to this country. I mean, there's all kinds of things, terrifying examples. I mean, like in the 50s, the United States government deported a lot of Americans of Mexican descent. Like they just deported them, like without any legal recourse. It's crazy. There's things that have happened in this country that make no sense when you learn about them today. But the idea is that people came to this country for a new life, to create something new for their family and their descendants. And then people are saying, oh, but then you pulled up the ladder and you're not allowing other people to be able to access that same safety. I mean,
Right.
which today, arguably, is it a safer place to be? I don't know. If the United States is, other countries are starting to warn their citizens about visiting the United States
Right.
because of what's happening.
Right.
So the question of safety is not really, it's an open question right now if the United States is a safer place to be. The other thing that Johnson talks about is border. And he talks about borders are biblical. He claims here, this is from his statement, the Bible speaks favorably and consistently about distinct nations of people and about borders and walls that are built to guard and secure people, property, and jurisdictions. When Nehemiah heroically led the Jewish remnant to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem after their enemies had destroyed those walls, he was doing the noble work of God. That's what Mike Johnson says. One of the things that's very interesting to me about that is that you look at the border that he claims Nehemiah was rebuilding, and these are walls of a city. These are the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And the Judeans, the people of the Israelites, the people of Judea, they were conquered by the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire. It happened twice. They were sent into exile other people were left in that area, and then they were able to come back some 70-ish years later. So this is a couple of generations, and they're coming back and, quote unquote, reclaiming their city and their land. But there are other people still living there, which a lot of times these are the people that moved into the area or who were living there but not sent into exile are often called people of the land. So they were just people who were there.
Yeah.
And the city of Jerusalem, that was a city. You know, there wasn't a country. And it was a physical defense still because people had to defend themselves physically against people trying to, you know, take them over. And again, the city of Jerusalem was again conquered by another country, by another empire. And then later, you know, in the time of Jesus in the New Testament, they were occupied by the Roman Empire.
Right, right.
So they didn't even have their own borders. They didn't even have their own legal system. They were conquered by the Roman Empire. They were occupied.
They were conquered. Were they asked to assimilate? I don't think they were.
They weren't. They still kept their own religious beliefs. They kept their temple.
Until later.
Until the Romans,
Yeah,
there was
but
an
for the most
uprising
part,
in 66 by Jewish zealots again, and then there was the terrible siege of Jerusalem.
But for the most part, in Jesus' time.
Yeah, in Jesus' time, when he was alive, they were still able to speak their language. They were able to have their beliefs.
Their customs, their beliefs. And even when it came down to, you know, Jesus's death, you know, you could see Pontius Pilate, I don't want to deal with this. What this is a weird thing is going on here. This is between you and him and your religion. And he kind of tries to back off and say,
Let's also point out that Jesus was executed by the state.
Yes.
He was considered a criminal.
Yeah.
When we start talking about what's legal and not, it becomes so arbitrary. One final piece that we wanted to look at is the actual biblical language of what we're talking about, because biblical Hebrew doesn't have as many words. It just doesn't as we have in English today. And so we need to look at what are the words that we are actually talking about. And so one word that we've already talked about is a stranger, being a stranger among us. Jesus talks about being a stranger, and Jesus talks about welcoming the stranger in Matthew. So stranger is one word.
And he lived that. I would like to say he lived that, you know, to the point where, you know, he's using Samaritans as the heroes in his stories. He's talking to the woman, he ends up calling her a dog, but, you know, he's
the Syrophoenician woman,
Thank you. I can never say the whole thing. But I mean, it's like he lives that principle that all should be welcomed and should have, you know, access to, you know, God like everybody else, you know, like the Jewish people. And so I find it frustrating. People like Mike Johnson will use the word, but they don't use Jesus. They're going to use Paul, you know, but when you take these ideas and put it against how Jesus lived and walked, it's very different. And I don't understand why we're not looking to Jesus. If he's God, why are you not following Jesus? I saw something this morning where somebody says, people wonder why this generation is so much more empathetic and compassionate, and, you know, this younger generation coming up, and why, you know, kids that grew up in these evangelical houses are now socialists, I guess is what it was. And the guy was like, you gave us wristbands that said WWJD. What'd you expect us to do? And I was like, that's so true.
It is so true.
You know?
Yeah.
Like, you made us as a generation consider what Jesus did. Not Paul, Jesus. But then you quote Paul as if he's the one that we should be listening to.
So then we have one of the main words is the Hebrew word ger or gear, G-E-R. I don't know how to pronounce it. And the Greek word in the New Testament is paroikos, and it's sometimes translated as sojourner. The definition of this is a foreigner who is traveling through a land or one who has taken up residence in that land. The key is that the sojourner has no familial or tribal affiliation with those among whom he or she is traveling or living. And some places it's translated as sojourner. There was another translation you were saying that it really is better translated as
A resident foreigner,
a resident foreigner.
meaning they're going to be here a while. They're going to live amongst us, but they are not necessarily within our cultural, tribal sphere, but they are living long term among Israel, kind of a thing.
From the New Interpreter's Study Bible, they were saying that maybe the best way to the best word today to translate this word is actually refugee, which I found really interesting. That might be the best translation today, is to think of it as a refugee, someone who's having had to flee or leave. And they point out that a lot of times people have to leave because of famine. So it's a very basic human need of just not being able to eat. You know, people are starving and they have to leave the land that they would have called their home.
Which we see in the Bible all the time. And one of the other things that it is said about the resident foreigners is that they are usually economically vulnerable without land or clan protection.
Yeah.
And probably came from somewhere else due to famine. We see that in the book of Ruth.
Yeah. So we've got Leviticus 19:34. This is often quoted. The stranger who sojourns with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that's one of the passages that is referred to. And then often the sojourner / refugee, resident alien, they are often lumped together with widows, orphans, and the poor because they are kind of a class of people that don't have status, that don't have access to resources. Because if you don't have land, you are at the mercy of trying to find food and work among the people around you. So then the other word that comes up is what's often translated as foreigner. And so foreigner is Zar, Ben Nakar, and Nokri. I know I'm pronouncing those wrong. That's, and that's basically, so much of the language is in and out, someone who's an insider and someone who's an outsider. And so, you've got this idea of a foreigner. And then in the New Testament, you've got other words like xenos, which is where we get the word xenophobia from. And then you've got allotrios, allophoulos, allogenes. But by the time of the New Testament, it's a very metropolitan kind of time. So, you have the Roman Empire has conquered Judea, and so the Judeans are an occupied people, and you have all kinds of languages being spoken in Jerusalem. You've got people traveling from all over the place. And so you have these distinctions between different kinds of people and different languages that people are speaking. But, and here is where Paul does become interesting, is that Paul says the distinctions between people are erased in Christ. And so we are all together in Christ. And so Paul is saying that these things don't matter anymore, which is also a very interesting wrinkle, because he makes it even more explicit than I think Jesus did. As we kind of wrap up this long conversation about how we are where we are today, and what, like the Speaker of the House is using a biblical argument to make a theological argument about immigration in the United States and what, the Bible tells us about this. It's important, I think, to just decide to think about how do we use the Bible? How do we make decisions in our time that are moral, ethical, theological, and how do we make these decisions? And I think that is the question before us. The Bible says that if a man rapes a woman, he has to marry her and she has to marry him. We would not agree that is something that is not legal today,
Yes.
that a family would force a woman to do that.
Right.
There is a passage that allows parents to stone a child to death if they disobey the parent. That is not a legal option today. That is no longer legal in the United States.
Thank God.
Yeah. So we have to decide, just because something shows up in the Bible, does that mean that is we have to decide, how do we handle the Bible? And I think that's one of the things that we have been grappling with for months now on this podcast, and helping people unpack what the biblical text says so that people can make decisions themselves about what is a moral, ethical, theological decision or belief based on these things.
Right. I mean, it does go back to WWJD, doesn't it? What would Jesus do? And would Jesus allow everybody here? I mean, again, I'm not going to say everybody, but the way that people are being dehumanized and just treated and abused, I don't think Jesus would do that, whether he said we should have boundaries or not. I like what Dan McClellan says when he was talking about directly to this, what Mike Johnson said too. He says, yeah, borders are biblical. So is polygamy. So is rape. So is that. That doesn't mean it's all right and we don't have to have a discussion. And just to say it's biblical and then walk away, which I believe his last line is, Mike Johnson's.
The Bible tells us so.
Yeah, done. It's like, yeah, no, that's not the way it should happen anymore. And on top of that, yeah, he is, there's a very small separation of church and state nowadays, or religion and state. I do know that our founding fathers said no religion should be the one that takes over the government. And yet here we are. It's a scary time, but we keep fighting.
And we have to decide, those of us who have a different understanding of what Jesus did in the world and who he was in the world, we have to decide, are we just going to give up and let these interpretations of who Jesus was and what it means to be a Christian take over? Or are we going to stand up for what we believe the message is that Jesus gave? And I encourage everyone to continue to stay in conversation with your loved ones, to let us know what your thoughts are. These are really hard days. These are very challenging days. Everyone's feeling, I think, that pressure to do something, and everyone can do different things to help support what many of us think is freedom in this country and what that means. So we are curious about your thoughts in these very challenging days.
Amen. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you next time. Bye.